Dear all, welcome to ANAMED Library Talk. At today's talk, we have distinguished speakers with us, Suraiya Faroqhi and Veruschka Wagner. Today's talk is entitled Women in the Ottoman Empire, a Social and Political History. This paper focuses on the manner in which the catastrophes of the early 20th century found their way into the writings of three literature females born into the late Ottoman world. After having established themselves, respectively, as a teacher, a school counselor, and an author of children's books, Mediha Kayra, Belkıs Halim Vassaf, and Cahit Uçuk wrote memoirs in which they tried to make sense of their experiences. While we cannot verify most of their statements, we can place their claims into a context derived from historical research, which allows us to say whether a given story is believable in the light of present-day information. Admittedly, what passes for historical knowledge among present-day generations also has very serious limitations. At this point, I would like to introduce you our speaker and moderator. Suraiya Faroqhi, after careers at Middle East Technical University, Ludwig Maximilians Universitat, and İstanbul Bilgi University, she now teaches at İbn Haldun University as a professor of history. She focuses on early modern social history, particularly commerce, artisan production, and women, paying special attention to the survival tactics of Ottoman urbanities with limited means. She is a corresponding member of the British Academy. Her most recent books are The Ottoman and Mughal Empire, Social History in the Early Modern World, and Women in the Ottoman Empire, A Social and Political History. Veruschka Wagner is a research associate at the Department of Islamic Studies and Middle Eastern Languages at the University of Bonn and member of Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies, where she leads two working groups and a lecture series. She holds a PhD in Islamic Studies on Ottoman travelogues about Europe from the University of Bonn, where she also studied communication studies and phonetics, translation studies, and German. Her current research project is part of the priority program, Trans-Ottomanica, Eastern European Ottoman Persian Mobility Dynamics, funded by the German Research Foundation, and focuses on the agency and mobility of slaves in 16th and 17th century Istanbul. At the same time, she is being funded by the Volkswagen Foundation for a research project on late Ottoman and Turkish Republican humor magazines and caricatures. Dear attendees, please bear in mind that your video and audios are closed. Please type your questions in the chat section. Your questions will be answered in the Q&A session. Now I'm passing the word to Veruschka Wagner. Thank you.
Thank you, Idem, for the introduction. Welcome, Suraiya Hocam. Welcome to the audience. It's a pleasure to be here and to take over the moderation of the session. I would also like to thank ANAMED and Koç University. So today we are going to talk about Suraiya Faroqhi's book, Women in the Ottoman Empire, and which was published 2023. It's a book on women and their agency starting from the 15th century to the end of the Ottoman Empire. It's about women from the elite households, but also non-elite households, Muslim and non-Muslim women, women in urban and rural areas from cities like Istanbul, but also others, Bursa or other regions like Syria and Egypt. And in the first part, Suraiya is going to give a summary of her book and talk about the life experience of a number of women. And afterwards, we're going to see a few images and then move on to the Q&A session. We already prepared a few questions, but we are also very much interested in the questions of the audience. So please, dear audience, write your questions into the chat so I can collect and select them. Suraiya Hocam,
yeah,
the floor is yours.
right here.
Thank you.
Okay, I mean, first of all, thanks for being here, or at least I assume that you are here. I hope that you have not turned off the loudspeakers because you're waiting for something else. Okay, I mean, this book has been around for 2 years already, and it's an attempt to pull together the research that has been done so far. I mean, when we look at books intended on Ottoman history, intended for the general reader, very often you get the impression that this society consisted exclusively of males. And when, let's say, in the discussion after such a paper, the speaker is challenged, the answer will be, well, there aren't any sources on women, especially outside of the palace orbit. Now, I mean, that made some sense, let's say, until the 1970s, because until the mid-70s, really, the information that we had concerned almost exclusively royal women. But then, in the middle 70s, Ronald Jennings of Illinois University, who unfortunately died at a relatively young age, he came up with an article on Anatolian women. I mean, his work had been on Kayseri for his dissertation, and he then wrote an article about the women of Kayseri. And he found that there were quite a few divorce cases, and there were even cases of a woman running away from her husband and refusing to go back. And there were also cases of female property owners, real estate, who held real estate, rented out or sold houses. And, well, what he showed was, first of all, that there, at least for certain periods and for certain places, there is evidence on non-royal women. In the case of Kayseri, not before 1600. I mean, the Qadr registers existed, but coherent information is mostly from the 17th century. And I mean, people then started to look whether there were other places with a lot of evidence or significant quantities of evidence. And that led to the question, since these were all entries into the Qadr registers, necessarily these documents were issued by the scribes of the Islamic court, and the rules and regulations that governed court documents applied also to the documents concerning women. I mean, women were at a disadvantage in certain situations. When it came to inheritance, a woman inherited only half of what a man in the same relationship to the deceased would have received, meaning a sister inherited half of what a brother would have received. But it may not have been a great amount of money, but it was something. And according to the law, it was her undisputed right. In the same way, I mean, women property owners emerge because no marriage was valid without the future husbands handing over the bridal gift. And I mean, in practice, there may have been people who got around this, but at least in theory, according to the law, without the bridal gift, there was no valid marriage. Well, so we do have documents concerning marriage contracts and also specifying what what money the woman was due to get when the marriage ended, either because one of the partners died or because of a divorce. And so therefore women property owners were not rare, and Islamic law allowed them to conclude contracts and to litigate, which is, quite different from most early modern European legal systems, where the wife, an unmarried woman, could do the things I just described, but once she was married, the identity of the wife was subsumed under the identity of the husband. This is not true according to Islamic law. So as long as the law was applied, we have these women property owners. At the same time, the inheritance might not be very great, and the bridal gift might also be quite modest. And what's more, greedy male relatives might find ways and means of depriving the woman of her share. All these things could happen and did happen. But, in this case, at least sometimes, the case was discussed in court, and the judge had to make sure that the whole affair was entered into the register. Very often there was no decision. The reason for that being that many cases ultimately were settled out of court because the complainant did not have enough evidence. The rules of proof were quite strict, and then people were encouraged to settle their differences out of court. That's the so-called sulh. And then, we find we find cases which nobody could decide according to the law, but the judge was supposed to help the parties find some kind of agreement. And how he did that and how the partners did this, that differed from one place to another. And it was also different, let's say, in the 16th century, practices differed from those in the 18th century. And then, of course, there are the divorce cases. In principle, a husband could simply divorce his wife without further formality, but he would have to pay the second half of the bridal gift. And, well, he might not be willing to do that. Or if he died, then the wife was entitled to the bridal, the mihri mu'ajjal is what it was called. It was the bridal gift that was put off until the death of one of the spouses. And once again, the fact that all this was legally established didn't mean that that people really abided by the rules. We often do not know what happened to the women. Because all early modern courts and practices were male-centered, and therefore what happened to the women was often of very little interest. That's true in, when you read Ottoman sigils. It was also true in early modern England or Germany or France, whatever. There's a famous story a monograph on northwestern Italy, where there were also rules that protected the property of the wife, but the local variety of sigilat say a bit more than the Ottoman variety does. And then we learn of all the horrible tricks that people used in order to force the wife to give up her share in favor of her husband. So all this, we have to keep in mind that this was a problem. Well, I mean, in my book, I try to approach the question, well, under these circumstances, how did women survive? And I mean, unfortunately, we cannot say very much about rural women. I mean, there were exceptional cases when rural women managed to get to the urban court, usually if their village was close enough to the town. But a lot of the time, probably, they didn't. And so therefore, we can say that the Qadr registers give us an idea of the practices in the larger towns. Well, I mean, what happened was that, again, according to the law, the husband was supposed to support his wife, and she was supposed to obey him. Well, I mean, he could probably force her into obeying him a lot of the time, not always. But if he just disappeared and refused to divorce her, then, I mean, she was kind of pushed into a corner with very little means of redress. And this was an issue that not just only the women, but also legal scholars debated. So, I mean, then what could these women do? Well, they could find, if they were lucky, they might get support from their families. And if you imagine that in the early modern age, girls were married when they were quite young, I mean, their fathers or older brothers might take an interest in their welfare and, question the behavior of the husband who was kind of getting off the rails. And I mean, especially family foundations might allow women a share of the revenue that was generated by a garden or a rented house or a mill or whatever that previous generations had put in trust. So we have family support, either directly or through a family waqf. And then we have work. And in principle, as I said, the husband was supposed to support his wife, but if he died and he left no property of any importance, or if he just took off, then she might have to find a way of earning money. And I mean, we occasionally find women, for instance, in Bursa, in the silk trade, who prepared the silk for the loom. I mean, in Anatolia, women did not weave silk, which is very different from China, where weaving, including silk weaving, was a female occupation. So therefore, I mean, work, especially, in textile towns, would have been, or if they had even a small amount of money, then they might invest this, lend it out, because while, according to the law, it was not permitted to demand interest, we know that in practice it did happen and it was tolerated. So therefore, I mean, some women with a limited amount of money might, in fact, lend it out and collect something like 15% interest. You'll say that's high, but then in the early modern period, money was extremely scarce, and therefore interest was high. So, I mean, money lending might be a way of making ends meet. Maybe not enough. Few women had enough capital lent out that they could just live on this. But as a supporting source of revenue, money lending was probably of importance. I mean, in Kayseri and in Bursa and other places, we find these women in the Qadr registers. Well, and then you ask yourself, well, I mean, most towns and cities had pious foundations, and they were supposed to give something to the poor. However, probably you'd have to be real lucky to get anything of substance out of, not waqfs that were not family waqfs. I mean, we already talked about family waqfs. But if we say, there is, let's say, a pious foundation attached to such and such a mosque, and people are, can apply for support. Well, sometimes we have lists of the people who are considered preferred objects of charity, you might say. And for instance, the foundation of Hürrem Sultan, of Sultan Süleyman's wife in Jerusalem, the list of beneficiaries has survived, and it's long, and there are some women, but they occur at the end of the queue. So, I don't know what happened if that year the foundation had a deficit. So therefore, probably, hoping for a great deal of support from formal pious foundations was probably an option only if you had a prior connection to the person who had instituted the foundation. I mean, Istanbul in the 16th century was full of pious foundations. Veruschka knows about this. Women who established a foundation to benefit their liberated slaves, and especially their liberated slave women. Because, I mean, these women were in danger of being re-enslaved or being used for immoral purposes. So an owner who wanted her slaves, her ex-slaves, to be rewarded for the service that they had performed would, in Istanbul in any event, quite often institute a foundation saying, it is to be rented out, and the beneficiaries will be my liberated slaves and slave women until there is nobody left. And then there are various other alternatives, and in the end, the money goes to the poor of Mecca and Medina. So therefore, if a person had been in the fortunate situation of establishing a connection with such a munificent person, well, then, of course, I mean, she might benefit from the Vakıf. Well, I mean, this is basically what these are the kinds of situations that I try to follow most of the time by reading the registers of the local qadis, and also by reading documents instituting pious foundations. And since these are extremely numerous, as a scholar, you depend on the work of people who have studied them previously. I have mentioned, for instance, Ronald Jennings, and they are, we have a sizable number of foundation documents, especially for Istanbul, also to some extent for Cairo. In smaller places, there seems to have been less opportunity for women to benefit from these foundations, but they did exist. I mean, I was curious at one point, and I went through a Vakıf register of Aydın, that's the Aegean coast, a fairly prosperous region. And there we find that there were fewer women who had instituted Vakıfs, but they did exist. Most of them were somehow associated with the Aydın, who by that time, we're talking about the middle of the 16th century, they were no longer independent princes, but they were still people of status and property, and some of them, including the women, instituted pious foundations. As I said, the percentage is very small compared to what we see in Istanbul, or in the 16th century, or in Cairo in the 18th century. But in any case, at least in principle, this exists. So then I have tried to follow this through, dividing up the time span, and it's quite arbitrary, namely the period before 1700, and then from 1700 into the middle of the 19th century, and at the end, the situation during, let's say, the last 70 years of the Ottoman Empire's existence. How much time have I left, Veruschka?
You still have enough time.
Hmm?
You can continue. You still have enough time. You can continue like this. So
Okay.
we already talked for 15 minutes, but it's okay. Just continue. Go on.
Okay, fine. Well, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, makes me very happy, because I'm always worried of speaking longer than the allotted time and making a mess of people's arrangements. So therefore, we can look at different towns and different conditions. And we find, for instance, that in 18th century Cairo, women were much more inclined to have their marriage contracts recorded in the Qadi registers. And there is an Egyptian scholar, Eneli Hanna, who has worked on this. And she says that probably the women who went to the trouble and probably expense of having these documents recorded already had some kind of bad experience, and they wanted to make sure that there was no repetition in the new marriage. So we find, for instance, women who specify who make sure that the contract says that the husband can be away from the family dwelling only for 1 day a week or 2 days a week, something like that. The background, I mean, I don't know this directly. I got this out of Hannah's articles. The background is that in Cairo, it was unacceptable for a man who had more than one wife to house his wives in the same compound. I mean, we know that this happened, for instance, in Eastern Anatolia, but in Cairo, that was kind of out. And then, you know, given transportation within the city, if you said that he can only be away for 1 night, well, that limits the amount of time that this man can devote to his second wife. And then, I mean, there are different ways of making life uncomfortable for the husband if he neglects the woman that he is now marrying. Now, in Istanbul, this was not customary until the late 18th century. But then the custom also arrived in Istanbul, and there is a very interesting dissertation under the guidance of Cemal Kafadar, which shows that women apparently went to the Qadi to record their marriage contracts if they figured there was going to be trouble. And they might suspect that their husband was going to divorce them, or the husband was ill, and they could see that if he died, the relatives would refuse to give her her share of the inheritance. So for such reasons, they would then make sure that the conditions of under which they had married were a matter of public record. Now, I say public record. This in itself contains a problem, because, I mean, in the Ottoman Empire, well, we have a highly developed bureaucracy, and as we all know, bureaucrats want written documentation. I mean, it's true today. I mean, even if today the written documentation is generated by a computer, it's still, a written piece. And Ottoman 18th century bureaucrats were no different. They also wanted such materials. On the other hand, and in fact, in the 18th century, we have a real inflation of documents. And on the other hand, Islamic religious law privileges witnesses to the actual event. Now, there is a way around that, because in many cases, the court would accept a witness who was not a witness to the actual event, but who says, I was a witness when this arrangement was entered into the Qadi registers. Well, that was a way of making sure that the arrangement would stand, even if the people involved had been dead for some time. So therefore, I mean, there is a built-in tension between the Ottoman bureaucracy that prefers written documents, and really, the legal experts who want to see witnesses. And I mean, today, among people who are interested in questions of law and society, that's a debate that continues to be quite lively. Well, and then, I mean, as I said, the 18th century has produced enormous piles and piles of documents, and especially Cairo is great that way, because there we have Waqfiyas, foundation documents, concerning foundations instituted by women who were former slaves. And these women often, in the 16th century, the Mamluks of Cairo, of Ottoman Cairo, married local women. And so therefore they developed close ties with the local population. But in the 18th century, quite a few Mamluks imported their slave women and later wives from the area to the north of the Black Sea, where they had come from. And then some of these women had, I mean, rather exciting biographies, because they might come as a slave woman, and then in the second half of the 18th century, the Mamluks of Cairo were constantly fighting one another, and it was a question of the winner takes all. So very often the loser was killed by the winner, and the winner took over the household of the loser, and then, in order to stabilize his position, he might liberate and marry one of the principal women of, his predecessor's harem. And this might happen more than once in the lifetime of such a woman. And in the end, they might have a rather considerable fortune. I mean, are there any situations that provide information about whether women received social support? Well, that was what I was trying to explain. I mean, the Waqfs supported certain women, usually women who had been associated with the Waqf in question. I mean, if they didn't have any kind of association, probably often they were out in the cold, and probably depended on the informal charity of their neighbors. I mean, this was an issue. I mean, we hear, for instance, that in the 16th century, a slave from the arsenal works for a private household, because in winter, when the galleys are not operative, these people get very little to eat, so they are able to go into the city and work. And then, I mean, we have the memoirs of such a person who managed to have somebody pay his ransom, and he returned home. And he tells us that he apparently knew some Turkish, probably not that much, but enough to get by. And he tells about a woman telling her husband, "Now look, this fellow is poor. be a bit generous. So, I mean, presumably, people got something from the informal charity of their neighbors. But, I mean, you couldn't count on that. It was something that happened if you were lucky. So, therefore, I mean, we don't hear much about Istanbul beggars, but there is one such text, which I didn't find. I found it in somebody's study. And there it's a case of old women, fairly, sickly, and people who will kind of induce people to give them alms. And there are entrepreneurs who will buy them and then put them out to beg. That's like the story of Oliver Twist, which I'm sure many of you know. And I mean, there was apparently, occasionally, there were people who acted like the employer of Oliver Twist, who sent boys out to beg. And in this complaint, we hear that this man acquired old women as slaves and sent them out to beg. But as I said, we have very little information on beggars. We don't know how, we cannot even estimate how or what their share of the population may have been. Now, I think, after having gone into this for some time, I imagine you will see that we have talked about business women. We have talked about women with a certain amount of property, real estate and other. And I told you that we have so little evidence on rural women that I'm not going to talk about this right now, because you start, focusing on 4 or 5 documents, and then in the end you ask yourself, well, what's the validity? On the other hand, there is a lot of evidence available on royal women. And we have several monographs that are important. And one text that's a kind of reference work that I would highly recommend is Necdet Sakaoğlu's Bu Mülkün Kadın Sultanları. So, it's about the female members of the Ottoman dynasty, including, not just the daughters and sisters, but also the slaves and the manumitted slaves. And, somebody says here.
Suraiya Hocam.
From, yeah.
I'm going to take care of the questions in the chat.
Oh, okay, good.
After your
I don't have
in the
to.
you don't have to look at them.
Oh, okay, fine. Makes it easier for me.
Yes.
So, we said that these women found it difficult to make ends meet. And on the other hand, some of the palace women could be quite wealthy. And an example is Mihruma, the only daughter of Sultan Süleyman. I'm sure some of you know her, at least her name, from TV plays. And she was married to the Grand Vizier of the time, Rüstem Pasha. And Rüstem Pasha, if he hadn't been Grand Vizier, he probably would have been one of the great capitalists of the 16th century. Whenever there was an opportunity to make money, He was sure to find it. And perhaps because the couple had a significant amount of money, she especially, because she survived Rustam Pasha, was able to take care of her descendants. And there was, in the 17th century, a family called the Sultanzades. And the Sultanzades, this was not a reference to the Sultan, it was a reference to the princess, who was, so to say, the female ancestor of this fairly long-lived family. So, I mean, some royal women might, outlive their husbands and become prominent in their own right, but probably they were the exception. Most women in the palace probably never saw the Sultan. There is a study by our colleague, I'll say her name in a minute, and she has studied the fortunes and fates of women who had served in the palace as slaves and who were then manumitted and married off. And the Sultan and the treasury kept track of these women because, although they were free, the Sultan, as the former owner, was their patron and had a right to a share of the inheritance. So, therefore, it's Betül, wait a moment.
Betül İpşirli Argıt.
Yeah, exactly. Betül İpşirli Argıt. And Betül has written a whole monograph on these women. And, so we can see they were usually not very wealthy. It all depended on the fortunes of the husband to whom the court had married them. But, they were people of some standing. And, in İpşirli Argıt's book, you can see that they had property and they had prestige. And some of them had an education because, from the middle of the 17th century onward, Mehmet IV started to sponsor the education of palace slave women as musicians. Apparently, the background was, according to what the documents say, that up to that point, the young pages, gave occasional concerts in the harem, and the eunuchs who were in charge of them brutalized them. The pretext was always that they had looked at the girls. Well, the pages were teenagers, and the girls were presumably pretty. Of course, you can't prevent them from looking. And apparently, the Sultan decided that you couldn't enjoy music under those circumstances, and that a solution would be to have talented girls trained as musicians. And so from the second half of the 17th century onward, we have a group of palace musicians. Some of you may know this very famous miniature of Levnis, which shows a group of female musicians, presumably that was a bit, this was inspired. It's a bit later. It was probably painted sometime in the 1720s. And I mean, these were probably the kind of young women who had learned to play an instrument and who were able to play together. Well, in the 19th century, and we have another source, namely the memoirs of a woman named Leyla Saz. And I mean, Saz was not her original name, but she had a very long life. She lived until, I think, 1935, and the law required people to take surnames that came in 1934. So she took on the surname Saz. And she was born in 1850 as the daughter of a palace doctor. And it turned out that she was very talented in music and poetry. And this woman has left memoirs, and she talks about this group of female palace musicians. In the 19th century, they were no longer sent to the houses of musicians. That was apparently the custom under Mehmed IV, but rather the musicians came to the palace, and there'd be a couple of older people supervising the event. But otherwise, I mean, these girls had music lessons of the kind that I'm sure many of us have experienced. So therefore, I mean, the choir of young pages had existed already before that. It was certainly in existence in the early 17th century, maybe even earlier. And the choir of the girls was formed later, sometime, I mean, during the reign of Mehmed IV, but Mehmed IV had a long reign. So therefore, I mean, some of the palace musicians had really learned a trade. And I mean, I don't know, but I would imagine that if such a woman was in a difficult situation, that she would get an invitation into the house of a prominent family, and she would sing and play. And then when she left, discreetly, there would be, a sum of money, a little package ready for her when she left. I mean, this last part is simply my hypothesis, but that these women were trained musicians, and, if they were left without means, I find it probable, though not proven, that some of them, found a way of performing. What is this? Let's get rid of this. Yani faizli şu kadar. Yani, there's this absolutely incoherent little advertisement. I hope you don't see it. I can see it, and it's very bothersome, but there's no way of clicking it away. Okay, so I mean, we said that, ya şunu bir kapatabilir miyiz? Well, thank you. Thanks, Irem. I mean, she has gotten rid of this for us. So now we said, we talk about working to make a living. And I mean, these musicians were, they made a living through their art. Well, I mean, that since I am sure, time is running short, I would like to get to the text that Irem has mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, namely women of the very late Ottoman Empire who were you either became teachers or in one case became the author of children's books, a large number of children's books. And these women have left, well, in one case, it's a memoir. In a second case, it is a biography written by her son. We don't know to what extent he made it into a novel. I mean that, but what he tells us, even if not every detail is true, it fits into the period. And then there is one young woman who was educated at home because, I mean, her father had joined the War of Independence, had hoped to become a wali someplace, but he only became a kaymakam. And he was kaymakam of Hekimhan. And, well, I passed through Hekimhan in the middle 1970s. I mean, believe me, it was not a place where you could get a good education, probably. So this woman was educated at home and was largely self-taught. But then, I mean, when she came to Istanbul, she made a career for herself as a journalist. And what's important for us is an author of children's books, a great many children's books. Now, I mean, all three are put in a very difficult situation. They were born in the very last years of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, sometime between 1900 and 1910. And they were all refugees. Two of them from Rumeli, from the Balkans, and one of them from Trabzon. And I mean, the Trabzon memoir is especially interesting because usually memoirs are written by middle-aged and older people. Or, as I told you a minute ago, I mean, in one of our cases, the author didn't write it herself. Her son wrote a biography. On the other hand, this woman, Mediha Kayra, she wrote her own account of the flight from Trabzon and the way in which the family settled in Istanbul. And she became a teacher. And interestingly, I mean, she had been from a, well, notable family in Trabzon and lived that kind of life, but she was only about 16 when the family arrived in Istanbul. And then she developed talents that probably nobody suspected. I mean, she went to a teacher's training program and had a long career as a teacher. But this also involved learning things that were not part of, let's say, the Darul Muallimat. She learned to play the piano, and she learned to read French. And I mean, people who saw the books that she lived to be over 100, and a lot of the books were in French, meaning that, you know, she was comfortable reading French. Well, I mean, for a girl who comes from a provincial town and lives in the vicinity of Kadıköy, somehow, I mean, the idea of learning French and playing the piano is really something special. And as I said, she writes about her brother who was born after the family had settled in Istanbul, Cahit Kayra. He had been a politician and a businessman, but when he retired, he reinvented himself as an editor of late Ottoman texts. And among the texts that he edited was the memoir of his sister. And he also lived to be over 100. So it's quite fascinating. Well, and on the other hand, I mean, the other two memoirs or biographies are a lot, let's say, more melancholy. We're going to talk about Belkıs Halim, who was born around 1904 and died in 1998. So she too had a fairly long life, I mean, well over 90. And this woman was a refugee from Macedonia. Her father had died already. I mean, he was apparently much older than his wife. And the stresses and strains of preparing for a complete change of lifestyle, probably that was too much. In any event, he had a heart attack and died before the family was forced to leave. Well, and then a group of relatives, they found refuge in Salonika, which, after all, was the capital of Macedonia at that time. And there, the mother caught typhus and died. And, so the young woman, I mean, if she was born around 1904, then she was like 6 or 7 when all this happened. And the family ultimately found places on apparently an absolutely horrible steamer that took them to Anatolia. And since they had relatives in Akhisar, that's where they wound up. And apparently, Belkıs went to school attended the 3rd grade for a fairly long time because the school didn't have anything else to offer. Well, I mean, again, there was a piece of good fortune, namely, she was related to Zekeriya Serter, the journalist. And in fact, he was her older half-brother, meaning her father had married twice, and she was the product of the second marriage, and Zekeriya Serter was a son of the earlier marriage. And Zekeriya Serter was already married to Sabiha, and who I'm sure many of you know. And he suggested that Belkıs, who seemed to be a good student, should go to the Darul Muallimat. And I mean, we get in the memoir written by Belkıs Hanım's son, we get a marvelous kind of reminiscence of what it meant to be in school during World War I. And I mean, on the one hand, there wasn't much to eat. And she writes about, making jokes about, the food that was pretty much the same every single day. Well, boarding school food is never great, but under the conditions of World War I, of course, it was even worse than normal. But she managed to graduate, and apparently, with excellent grades, because she was then offered a fellowship by the American College for Girls. And I mean, ultimately, that joined Robert College and became Boğaziçi. And she graduated from the American College for Girls, and she felt that she wanted to further improve her education. And by this time, in the 1920s, Istanbul University was functioning. I mean, you might say that some departments were not so great, and from Belkıs Hanım's memoir, you get the impression she studied psychology and philosophy, and she wasn't much edified by what happened there. But she graduated and started to teach. And then a man who was already established as a psychiatrist asked for her hand in marriage, and he asked her directly, because after all, she didn't have a father or mother. So, I mean, she was at first not enthusiastic. And her son writes about this, that she had gotten used to making her own living and spending her money the way she thought was appropriate. And so she pulled faces. Well, the candidate, the namzet, they would have said in Ottoman times, was a kind of persistent. And when he realized he wasn't getting anywhere directly, he sent somebody to be a mediator. And this person said to Belkıs Hanım what, of course, the candidate could not have, the namzet could not have said on his own. He said, look, there are a great many beautiful women who are waiting for this man to make an offer of marriage. They would accept immediately. But he's not interested. He's interested in you. That should tell you something. Well, ultimately, Belkıs Hanım accepted, and in the end, they went to the United States together, where he wanted to further his education, and she got a master's in psychology from one of the very high-status women's colleges on the East Coast. It wasn't Vassar, it was one of those, like Vassar. And then she worked as a counselor, and especially on the question of how you can interest children who don't care about school, what you can do to motivate them. And she wrote a book on the subject, which ultimately the Ministry of Education published. And she worked for a very long time, and obviously was very successful in her profession as a children's counselor. Well, and then, the youngest one, Cahit Uçuk. Cahit is a woman and not a man. She was related to the Uçuk family, Coşkun Uçuk, the professor of law, and Bahriye Uçuk, his wife. But she didn't want to be confused with her prominent relatives, so she officially changed her name from Uçuk to Uçuk. And her parents apparently were great admirers of Hüseyin Cahit Yalçın. And so they named her Cahit, not Cahide, and she was okay with that. So, Cahit Uçuk is in fact a woman. And she as I said, told a lot of stories about growing up in Hikimhan, and also encounters with Istanbul and encounters with Antalya. I mean, they had all been, again, they were from Macedonia, and they were forced to leave their property behind. The grandmother got a small amount of money from the Turkish Republic, and she bought a house for herself in Antalya. So that is where Cahit Uçuk passed part of her adolescence. And I mean, it's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, because while Belkıs and Mediha both went to schools and took examinations, I mean, this Cahit Uçuk didn't do that. She had an education, as I think I told you, very traditional kind, namely that teachers came to the house. And I mean, she was motivated, of course, especially in terms of literature. And then she arrived in Istanbul and made a career for herself as a journalist and as an author of children's books. Well, why do I think that this is important? Because on the one hand, I mean, what happened to these women was absolutely terrible. I mean, especially in the somewhat novelistic biography of Belkıs Halim. I mean, her son describes the frustration and anger of Belkıs's mother, who dies as a young woman in Salonika, and who probably felt that she had missed out on life, which was true. And the little girl, who was still, you know, at most of primary school age, apparently was made to feel that she was, you know, one of the reasons why her mother's life had been so miserable, because if she had not been there, probably her family would have found her a second husband. But since she had a child, that became very difficult. So, I mean, these are absolutely, you know, horrible experiences. Or, I mean, Cahit Uçuk tells the story. They were also in somewhere in Macedonia, and the place where they were living was occupied by a group of, well, they were not Greek army. They were, you know, some kind of privately organized corps. I mean, probably not very different from robber bands. And one of the neighbors, a young woman, completely, I mean, who got the kind of danger they were in and started to scream. And then it turned out that the commander of this group, I mean, said, well, I understand. It turned out that in peacetime, he had been a student of Galatasaray Lisesi. And I mean, for him too, it was extremely painful and embarrassing to arrive there as an oppressor and, you know, to scare people out of their wits, which was obviously the case. And so you get, you know, these really horrible experiences. I mean, probably Mediha Kayra was best, was most protected among these children because, she was also so young that she probably didn't quite understand what was going on. On the other hand, these women managed admirably. I mean, for a girl who spent I don't know how long in third grade because Akisa had nothing else to offer, to get a master's degree in child psychology and write a book on how to motivate children who do not want to go to school. Well, I mean, that's an enormous performance. And in the same way, I mean, I already told you about Mediha, how she reinvented herself and, as her brother says, became the virtual head of the family because she was able to adjust to life in Istanbul very quickly, while her male relatives who were older found it very difficult to not be part of the, being Eshraf of Trabzon counted for nothing much in Istanbul after World War I. And Mediha Kayra knew how to cope with this situation. And her brother says she decided which child was going to go to which school, and he made decisions that normally the father of the family would have made, but he was not in a position to do this because, I mean, probably so badly shaken by these experiences that he was not able to, get his feet on the ground again. So on the one hand, absolutely disastrous experiences, but at the same time, these three women made something out of the situation. And I mean, I think that is what I would like to say at the end, because it's already 7:30, that, I mean, in these disastrous situations, there were women who managed to protect themselves and protect their children or their students. And therefore, I mean, I think this is the sort of message that we should be taking. I mean, there are people who can make a good life out of very difficult conditions, and that's what these three people managed to do. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Suraiya Hojam, for presenting on this fascinating topic and introducing us to these remarkable women, as you call them in your book. And if you allow me, I would like to share the images you brought along. And maybe you can say a few words on them. So
On what? I didn't.
I would like to share the images you brought along.
Okay, if you have them, I sent them to Irem.
Yes, we have them. Can you see them?
No. Okay. Now, this is one of my favorites. It is perhaps Fatma Aliye, but some people say that it might be her daughter. And as you can see, she has one of those bicycles that were, kind of a great novelty in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Incidentally, I mean, she wrote a novel called Refet, which has been reprinted, and which talks about a young woman who becomes a teacher. And perhaps I started to chase down these biographies after reading Fatma Ali's work on Refet because it has several things that I consider important. First of all, Refet is very poor and wants to become a teacher because it's a way of making a living for herself and for her mother. But when she gets older, and I mean, maybe a young teenager, she is invited by a family that is quite prosperous, and they have a house on the Bosphorus. And Refet spends a good deal of time, not just with her friend who has invited her, but also alone. And she discovers the beauties of nature and begins to understand that there is more than to getting an education than simply making a living. Of course, making a living is basic, but once you have secured that, well, then there are other things that you can do with your education. And I mean, that is one of the messages of this book by Fatma Ali. And that's why, I mean, I really like to put this picture in the foreground, whether it is really Fatma Ali or whether it is her daughter. Okay, the next one, please. Okay, now the sequence is a little bit off, but forget it. This is a costume picture. And I mean, costume books became fashionable, first among Europeans visiting Istanbul, starting in the second half of the 16th century. At that time, they had a practical reason, namely that ambassadors and embassy personnel needed to recognize the various officials in the palace or the various officials that they met in informal situations, and the way of recognizing them was by their clothing. So the earliest costume pictures were made for this practical purpose. And at first it was, something collected by embassy personnel. But then around 1700, Ottoman elite figures got interested as well. And Levni, the great miniaturist, who also produced pictures, images of the female musicians. Well, I mean, Levni produced costume albums showing Iranians, male and female, and also people of Bursa, again, male and female. Perhaps the women were not always the most respectable people you can imagine, but that's nothing, you cannot really prove it. They all looked very respectable in their miniatures. Now, this one is later. I mean, Levni lived in the first quarter of the 18th century, and the miniatures that you see here are, of course, in a much more kind of 19th century mode, and the person who drew them or painted them was a Fenerci Mehmet Efendi. So you can see again that there were Ottoman subjects who were interested in this. And I mean, here you can see an Istanbul woman. She's a Jariya, I think, in a rich family. But the same man also produced a series of costume drawings of young women on the islands, meaning Greeks. I presume that the reason was that he could persuade their families to allow him to draw them. Well, I mean, the album was published with a very fine introduction by Nuran Atasoy. And the Koch family owns several of these pictures. That's, I mean, how I was able to get access. I am very grateful for this permission. And so, you know, you can see how something that, a practice that entered the Ottoman Empire for purely practical reasons, ultimately became something that had an aesthetic interest. I mean, that was already true of Levni's custom figures, and it's also true of Fenerci Mehmet Efendi. Okay, could we have the next one, please?
Oh, okay, this one didn't work. Just a second. I couldn't open that one.
Okay. Yeah, it happens. I mean,
I'll try the other one, yeah.
Yeah, I have also had that experience occasionally.
Okay, somehow my computer is not opening the other ones. Sorry for that.
Okay.
I'll try the last one. Maybe it works. What about this one? No, I'm sorry. I
Okay.
don't know what happened.
Well, I mean, electronics are temperamental, unfortunately. Okay.
Well, okay.
In any event, I mean, the reason why I had hoped to show different, you know, types of females, mostly wealthy, I mean, as you have seen. And I wanted you to see the diversity. Also, I mean, Fenerci Mehmet Efendi drawing these women from the Greek islands in all their finery. So, I mean, while there was certainly a division between different social and religious groups, it would be an exaggeration to assume that there was no interaction. And I mean, Levni especially is an impressive example of this. And that, you know, was really why I wanted you to see these pictures. As I said, the technology defeated it.
Well, at least we could see two of them.
Yeah.
And we have a little time left, so maybe we can discuss a bit about some of the questions. I was wondering about the agency concept you use.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that we always have to adjust the concept of agency to the research we are doing. So could you just explain a bit more about how you used these
Well,
concepts?
I mean, I am quite unsophisticated in this. I look at what people do, and I mean, you probably have already noticed, you know, I emphasized female musicians, and I mean, in the book, I have various developments on people who embroidered for a living. And so I am interested in people who work to make a living, and I am interested in people who teach other people how to make a living, because that must have existed much more frequently than we know. I mean, there is a book by a man named Faroqhi who was a Sikh specialist. I don't think he was a historian, and that's a very good thing, because he didn't have the prejudices of, let's say, historians of the 1950s, because he wrote his book in the 1950s and then published it in 1960. He was he worked for the Ministry of Labor, and apparently it was his job to find out whether the silk industry of Bursa could be revived. And I mean, he collected a great deal of material from the Qadr Register, where, for instance, he found a young woman who was an apprentice to another woman. And I mean, she was supposed to learn how to weave a certain silk cloth called vale, which is not a terribly expensive or sophisticated silk, but it's silk cloth, all right. And I mean, so we get these people. We get people who work on their chukruk, which is a small implement which is used to unwind the yarn that is produced by the silkworms. And you cannot use it as is because it's too thin. But the way to use it is to twist it, and to twist 2, 3, 4 such threads together to make a usable yarn. And when it comes to preparing the silk for the loom, apparently there were quite a few women in Bursa who worked in this field. So once again, I mean, making a living and helping other people to make a living, like this woman who trained an apprentice. I mean, something went wrong. That's why we know about the story. But I mean, she certainly taught the girl to produce vale. I mean, if we had had the time, I would have liked to say more about the embroiderers, because that's an important, badly paid, terribly badly paid, but at the same time, a widespread way of making a living. Some of you may know the memoir of Irfan Orga, called Portrait of a Turkish Family. And Irfan Orga was a child during World War I. And his mother lost her male relatives at the very beginning of the war. And then there was a fire, and much of her property was gone. And I mean, but this woman, at one point, she, especially after the end of the war, she embroidered for a living. And I mean, again, managed, she had 3 children, she managed to keep them alive. I mean, they, especially Irfan Orga, very much resented some of the decisions that she had made. But as I said, he was there to be resentful. He might not have been if it hadn't been for her. So my notion of agency is to look out for the possibilities of survival for oneself, and also for the people close to the main figure of the story. And I mean, we occasionally get evidence of that, even for fairly early periods. I mean, there is a Japanese scholar called Jun Akiba, who is a specialist on 19th century educational history, and who has worked on literacy in the pre-Tanzimat period. And he has found that there were schools run by women, probably usually older women, in their houses, and they taught these children to read, probably not on a very sophisticated level, but to a certain extent, these children became literate. Well, apparently, in England at that time, there was a parallel called the dame schools. The dame school, the dames who taught also probably could not teach them much beyond, very basic, the 3 R's, but it was better than nothing. And I mean, Jun Akiba has the story of one such primary school teacher who found out that Mahmud II, who, when his children were born, he had the palace distribute gifts among teachers and school children. This was probably because when he came to the throne, he was the only surviving member of the dynasty. So his children were kind of, what ensured the survival of the Ottoman dynasty. And that was considered, something to be grateful for to the deity, and also something to celebrate. So this woman turned up with her girl students and was told by one of the bureaucrats in charge that girls were not invited. And she said something like, "No münasebet." I mean, they are students like the boys are. And she made a big fuss. And she threatened that she would present a petition and hand it over to the Sultan when he rode to the mosque. And bureaucrats, being bureaucrats, probably thought that they might get into trouble. Who knows? So it was probably easier to simply give her the customary gifts for the children and for herself and make her go away. But I mean, this is the sort of thing that I consider important. I mean, she was willing to stand up for the rights of these little girls as human beings. And I mean, that's basically what I have in mind when I talk about agency. I think, and that's why also I highlighted these 3 women from the tail end of the Ottoman Empire, because they all started out with a really disastrous situation. And at the same time, they didn't just sit in a corner and kind of, bemoan their fate, which they could have done, and legitimately they could have done this, but that they were willing to, put in a great deal of effort and imagination and make something of their own lives and the lives of their relatives. I mean, Cahit Kayra's remarks about Mediha being the head of the family and deciding where the children should be sent, presumably he was one of the people about whom she made decisions. And I mean, all this, for me, is part of agency.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left. Another big topic, important topic, is the one of sources. So maybe I can read one of the questions in the chat to you because it's related to that. Do you think that the study of travelogues written by Western travelers in the 19th century can provide information on Ottoman women? Are they used by historians as sources of information, even though we are well aware that they were biased by a colonized gaze?
Well, frankly, I mean, most of the time, European travelers are not a very suitable source, especially not on the subject of women. But I mean, there may always be exceptions. I mean, there is this woman who was the head of the American College for Girls at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, and who encouraged any number of young girls to pursue a professional education. And I mean, the woman who was the first doctor, well, you can argue as to whether she was a late Ottoman figure or an early Republican figure, because she started her medical studies when in the middle of World War I, when the empire still existed. And when she finished, the empire was gone, and she came back and worked as a doctor and worked especially in charities intended for children. And, well, once again, I mean, she insisted that she wanted to go. And the woman who was the principal of the American College for Girls encouraged her. So, well, when it comes, for instance, to this question of academic study for women in the late 19th century and early 20th century, I would say, well, this woman was a teacher and an educational administrator. Of course, you want to make allowance for the prejudices of the time, but at the same time, she was engaged in practical work. On the other hand, when people are not engaged in practical work, but kind of, just sit behind their desks and, well, I mean, moan and groan about the impediments that girl students typically suffer. Well, I don't think that that's very helpful. And people who write like that, I wouldn't take very seriously. On the other hand, I mean, Kadınlar Dünyası, when the editorial team fought for the right of Ottoman women to engage in paid employment, well, I mean, they managed to mobilize a couple of foreign journalists, especially Germans, because, I mean, this was the World War I period. And, well, I mean, this mobilization had a practical reason. And I would then take, if I haven't read the report written by this woman, but if I were to find it, I certainly would read it. And I would say that taking it with with a heaped soup spoonful of salt, you still want to know what these people have to say. On the other hand, as I said, when they're not doing anything, I would tend to take them and to not take them very seriously.
Okay, so thank you so much. It's almost 8 o'clock.
Right.
And thank you for your presentation. Thanks to the audience. It was a pleasure to be here. İrem Hanım, the word is yours.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Ağzınıza sağlık. And thank you the attendees. ANAMED Library Talks will continue in April. You can follow the details in our website and social media accounts. Thank you again and good evening to all.
Okay.
Good evening.
Good evening, and thanks for listening. I wonder how many people really listened.